Hello and welcome. Whether you've come here to drift into sleep or to quietly wander the forgotten cloisters of history, you're exactly where you need to be. Tonight, we're stepping behind the veil, past the candlelit silence and whispered prayers, into the hidden world of women who chose the convent, or had no choice at all. Some came for faith, others to escape. Some were rebels, others prisoners in all but name. Inside these walls, you'll find dangerous secrets, coded resistance, forbidden knowledge, and meals served with ritual precision and quiet dread. So if anything in the shadows of this story stirs your thoughts, leave a comment. Tell us where you're tuning in from, and what time it is where you are. Just be honest. Imagine waking up at 3 a.m, every single day, for the rest of your life. The bells toll in the darkness, and you rise from a wooden bed no softer than a coffin. You slip into rough wool that scratches against your skin, cover your head with a veil that will hide your face from the world forever, and walk barefoot across cold stone floors to pray for 2 hours before dawn even breaks. This was reality for millions of women across centuries, women who chose to disappear behind convent walls, abandoning everything they knew for a life that seems, from our modern perspective, almost unimaginably harsh. But here's what will shock you: they weren't all running away from something. Many were running towards something far more powerful than anything the outside world could offer. The medieval chroniclers called them brides of Christ, but that romantic term masks a truth far more complex and often disturbing than history books dare to tell. These women wielded influence that queens envied, controlled vast wealth that rivaled kingdoms, and held secrets that could topple governments. Yet they also endured punishments that would break most people, lived under rules that controlled every breath they took, and faced horrors that their families on the outside would never know. The question isn't just why they chose this life, it's how they survived it, and what they discovered behind those walls that kept them there even when escape was possible. Picture this: it's 1347, and a young woman named Eleanor stands at the gates of Barking Abbey, one of the most powerful convents in England. She's 16 years old, comes from a wealthy merchant family, and has just made a decision that will determine every moment of her remaining days on earth. Her father is furious. He's losing a valuable marriage alliance. Her mother is weeping. She's losing her daughter forever. But Eleanor isn't looking back. She's looking ahead at something her family cannot understand: freedom. Not the freedom we think of today, but a medieval woman's version of it. The freedom to read, to think, to control her own destiny, to never submit to a husband's will or die in childbirth bearing children she might not want. What Eleanor doesn't know, as those heavy wooden doors close behind her with a sound like thunder, is that she's entering a world that will strip away everything she thinks she knows about herself. The woman who emerges from this chrysalis of stone and prayer will be fundamentally different, stronger in some ways, broken in others, but always changed. The path to the convent began long before that final walk through the gates. It started in childhood, when families made calculations that had nothing to do with divine calling and everything to do with survival. In medieval Europe, daughters were expensive. They required dowries to marry, and if a family had too many daughters, it could mean financial ruin. A convent offered a different kind of dowry, still expensive, but often less than a marriage portion, and with the added benefit of securing the family's spiritual welfare. Some parents made this choice when their daughters were barely old enough to walk. But not all women arrived as children. Some came as widows seeking refuge after their husband's death left them vulnerable to greedy relatives or unwanted suitors. Others came as punishment: adulteresses, political prisoners, women who had defied social expectations and needed to be contained. Still others came because they genuinely believed God was calling them to serve. The convent walls held all these stories, and more, creating a complex ecosystem of ambition, desperation, and faith that outsiders rarely understood. The initiation process was designed to break down the individual and rebuild her as something entirely new. Picture young Eleanor again, now stripped of her fine clothes and dressed in the coarse brown habit of a novice. Her long hair, once her greatest beauty, lies in golden piles on the stone floor, cut away in a ceremony that symbolizes her death to the world. She's given a new name, chosen by the abbess, erasing even her identity. For the next year, she will learn the rules that will govern every aspect of her existence. The rule of Saint Benedict, written in the 6th century, became the blueprint for most medieval convents. It divided each day into precise segments, 8 prayer services called the Divine Office, manual labor, study, and meals taken in complete silence while someone read aloud from scripture or religious texts. Sleep was limited to 6 or 7 hours, broken in the middle of the night for matins, that 3 a.m. prayer service that would haunt their dreams for decades. Even their thoughts were regulated. Novices learned to confess not just their actions but their desires, their doubts, their moments of longing for the world they'd left behind. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. While society outside the convent walls grew increasingly restrictive for women, inside those walls, some found opportunities that would have been impossible in the secular world. Abbesses controlled vast estates, managed complex financial operations, and negotiated with kings and bishops as equals. They had their own courts, their own armies, their own prisons. Some abbesses were more powerful than most male nobles, commanding territories that spanned multiple counties and controlling wealth that could finance wars. The Abbey of Las Huelgas in Spain was known as the Female El Escorial because of its political influence. The abbess there held jurisdiction over more than 50 towns and villages, could grant pardons, and even had the right to hear confessions, a privilege usually reserved for priests. When royal princesses entered Las Huelgas, they didn't lose power, they gained a different kind of it. These weren't women hiding from the world, they were women reshaping it from behind seemingly impenetrable walls. Education was another unexpected pathway to power. While most women in medieval society remained illiterate, nuns were required to read Latin, study theology, and maintain libraries. Some convents became centers of learning that rivaled universities. Hildegard of Bingen, perhaps the most famous medieval nun, composed music, wrote medical texts, and corresponded with emperors and popes. Her visions were recorded in illuminated manuscripts that still astound scholars today. She developed her own language, created revolutionary musical compositions, and established healing practices that were centuries ahead of their time. Yet for every Hildegard, there were dozens of women whose stories were far darker. The convent could be a prison as easily as a sanctuary. Discipline was harsh and sometimes brutal. Nuns who broke rules faced public humiliation, solitary confinement, or physical punishment. Some were forced to prostrate themselves before the entire community while their failures were read aloud. Others were sentenced to bread and water for weeks, or forced to sleep on the stone floor instead of their already uncomfortable beds. The vow of silence, practiced in many convents, created its own form of psychological torture. Imagine living for years surrounded by other human beings but unable to speak except during designated times and only about approved subjects. Some nuns developed elaborate systems of hand signals and gestures, creating a secret language that allowed them to communicate their needs, fears, and occasionally, their rebellions. Sexual desire didn't disappear simply because women took vows of chastity. The medieval church was obsessed with the female body and its potential for sin. Nuns were taught to see their own bodies as sources of temptation and danger. They wore hair shirts, rough garments that scraped against the skin as constant reminders of their fallen nature. Some practiced more extreme forms of mortification, whipping themselves or wearing metal chains that cut into their flesh. The goal was to transcend physical desire through physical pain, but often the result was psychological trauma that lasted lifetimes. The convent's relationship with the outside world was complex and constantly changing. In theory, nuns were dead to the world, but in practice, they maintained extensive networks of communication and influence. Wealthy families continued to support their daughters and sisters in convents, often visiting regularly and bringing news, gifts, and sometimes pressure to use the nuns' influence for family advantage. Political refugees found sanctuary behind convent walls, and their presence often brought intrigue and danger along with them. Some convents developed reputations for laxity that scandalized church authorities. The convent of San Zaccaria in Venice became notorious for its parties, where nuns entertained visitors with music, dancing, and elaborate feasts. The nuns wore silk instead of rough wool, kept private apartments filled with beautiful objects, and maintained relationships that may have been romantic as well as spiritual. When reformers tried to impose stricter rules, the nuns rioted, barricading themselves inside the convent and refusing to comply. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of convent life was how it created a parallel female society with its own customs, traditions, and power structures. Nuns developed intense friendships that lasted decades, created artistic and literary works that expressed distinctly feminine perspectives, and established networks of support that extended far beyond individual convents. They were mothers to each other in ways that biological families often couldn't provide, and they created a form of sisterhood that gave meaning to lives that had been stripped of conventional family structures. The economic reality of convent life was far from the spiritual poverty that vows of poverty might suggest. While individual nuns owned nothing, their communities often controlled enormous wealth. The Abbey of Fontevraud in France was one of the richest institutions in medieval Europe, its abbess controlling an annual income that exceeded that of most kingdoms. This wealth came from dowries, donations, land holdings, and various business enterprises that nuns operated with remarkable skill. Nuns ran hospitals, schools, and manufacturing operations. They produced textiles, illuminated manuscripts, and pharmaceutical preparations that were sold throughout Europe. Some convents operated like medieval corporations, with sophisticated accounting systems and international trade relationships. The nuns of Santa Clara in Italy developed banking practices that were later adopted by major merchant families. They weren't just praying behind walls. They were running complex economic enterprises that helped shape the development of medieval commerce. The daily routine of convent life was designed to break down individual will and create spiritual transformation through repetition and discipline. But human nature found ways to assert itself even within the most rigid structures. Nuns created private friendships that sustained them through years of communal living. They developed personal devotional practices that went beyond prescribed prayers. Some kept secret diaries or letters that revealed inner lives far richer and more complex than their outward conformity suggested. The relationship between nuns and their confessors, the priests who heard their confessions and provided spiritual guidance, was often fraught with tension and manipulation. These men held enormous power over the women's spiritual lives, but the women often knew more about theology and had deeper educational backgrounds. Some confessors were genuinely holy men who provided wise counsel. Others were corrupt individuals who exploited their position for personal gain or sexual gratification. The nuns had to navigate these relationships carefully, using whatever influence they could muster to protect themselves and their communities. Food became a battleground between earthly desire and spiritual discipline. Many convents practiced extreme fasting as a form of religious devotion, but also as a way of asserting control in lives where most choices had been stripped away. Some nuns became so skilled at surviving on minimal food that they were considered miraculous. Others developed what we would now recognize as eating disorders, using starvation as a form of self-harm and spiritual expression. The question of whether these women were truly free or merely trapped in a different kind of prison has puzzled historians for centuries. The answer, like everything about convent life, is complicated. Some women found in the convent the only space in medieval society where they could exercise their intelligence, develop their talents, and wield real authority. Others discovered that the walls they thought would protect them had become the bars of a cage they could never escape. What's undeniable is that these women created something unprecedented in human history, a massive, international network of female communities that operated according to their own rules and priorities for over 1,000 years. They preserved learning during the Dark Ages, provided healthcare and education when no other institutions existed, and developed forms of spirituality and artistic expression that continue to influence our world today. Picture this: it's midnight in 1453, and Sister Marguerite sits alone in her cell at the Abbey of Saint Denis, just outside Paris. Her hands shake as she dips her quill in ink, writing words that could get her burned alive if discovered. She's recording what she heard in confession today, not from a fellow nun, but from the King of France himself. He's just admitted to poisoning his own brother to secure the throne. The weight of this knowledge is crushing her soul, but she cannot speak it aloud. She cannot seek absolution for the burden of knowing. All she can do is write, and hide, and pray that God will forgive her for keeping the devil's secrets. What happens when women sworn to hear the truth become repositories for the most dangerous secrets in medieval Europe? When the very vows that bound them to silence made them the perfect confidants for kings, murderers, and conspirators? The confessional booth wasn't just a place of spiritual healing, it was the medieval world's most sophisticated intelligence network, and nuns were its unwilling operators. Today, we're diving into the shadows behind the sacred walls, where holy women carried secrets so explosive they could topple governments, destroy dynasties, and rewrite history. These weren't just religious confidences, they were state secrets, murder confessions, and political conspiracies that powerful men whispered to women they believed would take their sins to the grave. But some of these women found ways to use what they knew, and others were destroyed by the weight of knowledge they could never share. The medieval church had a problem. Powerful men needed to confess their sins to maintain their standing with God, but they couldn't risk their secrets falling into the wrong hands. Male confessors could be bribed, blackmailed, or threatened. They had families to protect, ambitions to pursue, and political loyalties that could shift with the wind. But nuns were different. They were already dead to the world, bound by vows that made them untouchable and unbreakable. Or so the church believed. The reality was far more complex. Behind the veil of sanctity, some nuns became master manipulators who used confession as a weapon. They couldn't break the seal of confession directly, but they found other ways to act on the information they received. A whispered warning to a potential victim. A strategic illness that prevented a planned assassination. A prophetic vision that just happened to save the right person at the right time. These women learned to speak in riddles, to act without seeming to act, to wield power through apparent powerlessness. Sister Beatrice of Tuscany became legendary for her ability to prevent disasters through what seemed like divine intervention. When a corrupt bishop confessed to her his plan to sell church relics to fund his gambling debts, she developed a sudden urgent need to inventory the cathedral's treasures. When a merchant prince admitted to planning his rival's murder, she experienced mystical visions that led to the rival leaving town on urgent business. Her fellow nuns called her blessed with prophecy. In reality, she was running one of the most effective intelligence operations in medieval Italy. But the psychological cost was enormous. Imagine living with the knowledge that the man who brings you communion wine has murdered his wife. That the nobleman who donates generously to your convent has been selling children into slavery. That the bishop who oversees your spiritual welfare is planning to poison the Pope. The seal of confession meant these women couldn't warn anyone, couldn't seek justice, couldn't even share their burden with their fellow nuns. They had to smile, nod, and pretend that evil looked like holiness. Some nuns cracked under the pressure. The Abbey of Saint Foy in France kept detailed records of sisters who suffered what they called confessor's madness, a condition where nuns became unable to distinguish between the sins they'd heard and their own experiences. They would confess to murders they'd never committed, adultery they'd never engaged in, and heresies they'd never believed. Their minds had become so saturated with the evil they'd absorbed that they could no longer remember what belonged to them, and what belonged to others. The most dangerous confessions came from royal visitors. Kings and queens, princes and princesses, used convents as neutral ground where they could unburden themselves without political consequences. The Abbey of Fontevraud became known as the graveyard of royal secrets, because so many monarchs chose to confess their darkest deeds there. The nuns who heard these confessions knew which wars were based on lies, which royal children were illegitimate, and which treaties were signed under threat of assassination. Eleanor of Aquitaine herself made regular pilgrimages to Fontevraud, not just for spiritual reasons but because she needed a place where she could speak freely about the political machinations required to maintain her power. The nuns who heard her confessions learned the real reasons behind the Crusades, the true cause of her conflicts with her husband Henry II, and the secret negotiations that shaped the fate of medieval Europe. When Eleanor finally retired to Fontevraud, she brought with her a lifetime of secrets that the nuns were honor-bound to protect. The archives of these great convents became treasure troves of hidden history. While officially, nothing spoken in confession could be recorded, many nuns found ways to preserve the information for posterity. They developed elaborate codes and symbols, wrote in languages that only they understood, and created artistic works that hid historical truths in plain sight. The illuminated manuscripts produced by the nuns of St. Georgian contain what scholars now believe are coded references to political murders, secret alliances, and dynastic frauds that won't be officially acknowledged for centuries. Some nuns went further, creating secret societies within their convents dedicated to preserving and protecting dangerous knowledge. The Silencers, at the convent of Santa Clara in Italy, maintained a hidden library of confessional secrets, carefully catalogued and cross-referenced. They saw themselves as guardians of truth in an age of lies, preserving evidence of crimes that powerful men believed they'd buried forever. When the convent was finally dissolved in the 16th century, this library disappeared. Some historians believe it was destroyed, but others suspect it was moved to a location that remains secret to this day. The relationship between nuns and their confessors created another layer of complexity. Male priests who served as confessors to convents often found themselves in the strange position of confessing their own sins to women who couldn't absolve them but also couldn't judge them. Some of these relationships became twisted power games, where priests would reveal their corruption and abuse to nuns who were powerless to stop them but forced to listen. It was psychological torture disguised as spiritual guidance. Father Andreas of Cologne made a career of tormenting the nuns at the convent of St. Ursula by confessing his own sexual abuse of novices to the abbess. He knew she couldn't report him without breaking the seal of confession, and he used her horror and helplessness as a form of sadistic entertainment. The abbess, Sister Gertrude, endured years of this torture before finally finding a solution. She began having visions that led to Father Andreas being transferred to a remote monastery where he could do no harm. Her fellow nuns never knew how she managed to rid them of their tormentor, but church records suggest she found a way to communicate his crimes to higher authorities without technically breaking her vows. The burden of dangerous knowledge took different forms. Some nuns became obsessed with documenting everything they heard, creating vast mental catalogs of human evil that they could never share. Others developed elaborate systems of penance, trying to somehow atone for the sins they'd absorbed through hearing confessions. Still others turned to extreme forms of mysticism, claiming divine visions that allowed them to speak prophetically about future events they actually knew about through confessional secrets. Sister Marguerite, whom we met at the beginning, represents perhaps the most tragic category: nuns who tried to find ways to act on the terrible knowledge they possessed. Her secret diary, discovered centuries later during renovation of St. Denis, reveals a woman tortured by her inability to prevent the horrors she knew were coming. She recorded not just what she heard in confession, but her desperate attempts to find ways to intervene without breaking her vows. She developed mysterious illnesses that prevented important meetings, experienced prophetic dreams that led to investigations, and cultivated relationships with court officials who could act on carefully worded hints. But the knowledge eventually destroyed her. Her final diary entries describe a woman who no longer slept, who saw evil in every face, who had become so contaminated by the secrets she carried that she could no longer distinguish between good and evil. She died at the age of 32, officially from fever, but her writings suggest a woman who had been consumed by the darkness she was forced to absorb. The political implications of these confessional secrets were staggering. Wars were fought over successions that nuns knew were fraudulent. Treaties were signed by leaders whose legitimacy was questionable. Justice was perverted when judges were criminals and lawgivers were murderers. The nuns who knew these truths watched history unfold with the terrible clarity of those who see the puppet strings but cannot cut them. Perhaps most disturbing were the confessions involving children. Medieval society was brutal to its young, and powerful men felt free to abuse, exploit, and discard children without consequence. The nuns who heard these confessions faced an impossible choice: respect the seal of confession or protect innocent victims. Some found ways to circumvent their vows, providing sanctuary to endangered children or arranging for their protection through intermediaries. Others were paralyzed by the conflict between their religious obligations and their moral imperatives. The convent of the Sacred Heart in Prague became known for its mysterious ability to predict when children in the city were in danger. Local families began bringing their children to the convent for blessing whenever they felt threatened, and the nuns always seemed to know which children needed immediate sanctuary. The abbess, Sister Catherine, never explained how she knew, but records suggest that powerful men in the city were using the convent's confessional to boast about their plans, never suspecting that their victims were being warned through channels they couldn't trace. The psychological profiles of nuns who heard dangerous confessions reveal fascinating patterns. Many developed what modern psychology would recognize as dissociative behaviors, compartmentalizing the terrible knowledge they carried to preserve their sanity. They created elaborate mental filing systems, categorizing sins by severity, political importance, and personal impact. Some became obsessed with symbolic representations, creating art and music that expressed the emotions they couldn't verbalize. Others turned to extreme asceticism, punishing their bodies for the knowledge their minds were forced to contain. The most successful of these women learned to transform their burden into a different kind of power. They became extraordinarily skilled at reading human nature, predicting behavior, and understanding the hidden currents that moved their society. They developed networks of influence that extended far beyond their convent walls, using their reputation for wisdom and discretion to gather even more information from sources who didn't realize they were being questioned. They became the medieval equivalent of intelligence analysts, processing vast amounts of sensitive information and finding ways to influence events without leaving fingerprints. But the price was always steep. Even the most successful non-intelligencers paid for their knowledge with their peace of mind, their ability to trust, and often their faith itself. How do you believe in divine justice when you know that the most evil men prosper while good people suffer? How do you maintain hope when you see the corruption that infects every level of society? How do you pray when you know that some of the men saying Mass are murderers and the bishops giving blessings are thieves? The legacy of these women remains largely hidden because they were so successful at keeping secrets. The very skill that made them valuable also made them invisible to history. Their influence can only be detected in the negative space, the disasters that didn't happen, the corruptions that were mysteriously exposed, the evil plans that somehow went awry. They were the hidden guardians of medieval society, protecting it from evils that it never knew existed. Today, as we look back at these women who carried the weight of terrible knowledge in silence, we see both heroes and victims. They were heroes because they found ways to act on their knowledge despite impossible constraints. They were victims because they were forced to bear burdens that no human being should carry alone. Their stories remind us that sometimes the greatest courage is not in speaking the truth, but in knowing when and how to act on truth that cannot be spoken. In the shadows of the confessional, these women shaped history while remaining invisible to it, the ultimate secret agents of the medieval world. The year is 1562, and the morning sun casts long shadows across the courtyard of the convent of Santa Clara in Milan. But this isn't a peaceful scene of prayer and contemplation. Sister Benedetta stands atop the convent walls, a crossbow in her hands, while below her, 50 armed soldiers demand entry. Behind her, 40 nuns have barricaded themselves inside their sacred home, refusing to submit to the new religious reforms that would strip away everything they've built over centuries. What happens next will shock the Catholic Church to its core and prove that some women would rather die fighting than live in submission. This is the story of the convent rebels, women who broke their vows of obedience not in moments of weakness, but in acts of calculated defiance that changed the course of history. They weren't passive victims waiting for rescue. They were warriors who transformed their habits into armor, their prayers into battle cries, and their convents into fortresses that even professional armies couldn't conquer. The rebellion began decades earlier, not with violence, but with a single word: no. It was spoken by Abbess Caritas Pirkheimer at the convent of St. Clare in Nuremberg when Lutheran reformers demanded she surrender her convent to male control. This wasn't just about religious doctrine, it was about power, wealth, and the systematic destruction of female independence. The reformers promised the nuns they could remain in their convent, but under new rules, governed by men, stripped of their autonomy, reduced to decorative relics of an outdated faith. Caritas looked at these men who had never spent a day behind convent walls, who had never managed vast estates or educated young minds or provided medical care to entire communities, and she said something that would echo through history. "We have not come here to be governed by you, but to govern ourselves under God." It was a declaration of war disguised as a statement of faith. What the reformers didn't understand was that they weren't just attacking individual convents. They were threatening a network of female power that stretched across Europe. These abbesses communicated regularly, shared resources, and coordinated responses to threats. When word spread that convents were being dissolved and their wealth seized, the network activated. Messages flew between abbesses like battle plans between generals. They began moving assets, hiding treasures, and preparing for siege. The convent of Las Huelgas in Spain became the headquarters of resistance. Its abbess, Dona Maria de la Cruz, had already proven her military credentials by successfully defending her territories against Moorish raiders. Now she faced a different enemy, Spanish officials who wanted to reform her abbey by placing it under male supervision. Her response was swift and brutal. She expelled all male clergy from her territory, declared her lands independent, and began recruiting an army of displaced nuns from dissolved convents across Europe. Picture this scene: women who had spent their lives in prayer and contemplation learning to use weapons, practicing military formations in cloisters that had echoed with hymns for centuries. Former abbesses became military commanders, teaching strategy to novices who had entered religious life seeking peace but found themselves preparing for war. Kitchen knives were reforged into daggers, gardening tools became weapons, and the bells that once called nuns to prayer now served as alarm systems warning of approaching enemies. The siege of Santa Clara in Milan became the defining moment of the convent wars. Sister Benedetta, the crossbow-wielding nun we met at the beginning, wasn't just defending her home, she was making a statement that would resonate across Europe. The soldiers below demanded surrender, promising leniency if the nuns submitted peacefully. Benedetta's response has been recorded in multiple chronicles. "We are the brides of Christ, not the slaves of men. If you want our convent, you'll have to take it from our dead hands." What followed was a siege that lasted 6 months. The nuns had prepared well, stockpiling food, water, and weapons. They had also done something unprecedented. They had learned to fight. Not just physically, but psychologically. They used their knowledge of Scripture to justify their rebellion, quoting biblical examples of women who fought for their faith. They sang hymns while shooting arrows, making their resistance both military and spiritual. The besieging army faced a problem they'd never encountered. How do you attack holy women without appearing to attack God Himself? Every move they made was scrutinized by the public, who saw nuns defending their sacred vows against corrupt authorities. When the soldiers tried to starve the nuns out, local supporters smuggled food over the walls at night. When they attempted to breach the gates, the nuns poured boiling oil from windows, just like defenders of medieval castles. But Sister Benedetta's greatest weapon wasn't her crossbow, it was her mind. She had studied military history in the convent library, learning tactics from accounts of famous sieges. She understood that the siege wasn't just about physical survival, but about public perception. Every day the nuns held out, their cause gained sympathy, and their enemies looked more tyrannical. She orchestrated a propaganda campaign that would make modern spin doctors envious. Letters, smuggled out of the convent, described the nuns' suffering in vivid detail, but also their unwavering faith and courage. These letters were copied and distributed throughout Europe, creating a narrative of holy women persecuted by corrupt authorities. Artists began depicting the siege as a religious struggle, showing nuns as martyrs defending their faith against worldly power. The siege of Santa Clara became a symbol of resistance that inspired uprisings in convents across the continent. The psychological transformation of these women was remarkable. Nuns who had spent decades in submission and obedience discovered reserves of strength and cunning they never knew they possessed. Sister Margaret of the convent of St. Bridget in Sweden wrote in her secret diary, "Yesterday I was afraid to speak above a whisper. Today I commanded 50 men to defend our walls. I do not know this woman I have become, but I know she will not surrender." The tactics employed by rebel nuns were as varied as they were effective. The convent of St. Ursula in Cologne developed an elaborate intelligence network, using their connections with noble families to gather information about planned attacks. They knew which officials could be bribed, which soldiers were sympathetic to their cause, and which routes were being used to move troops. Their network of spies extended throughout the Holy Roman Empire, making them one of the best-informed military forces of their time. Some nuns took their rebellion beyond passive resistance to active warfare. The legendary Sister Joanna of Arc, not to be confused with Joan of Arc, led a company of armed nuns in raids against officials who were seizing convent property. Disguised in men's clothing, she and her followers would attack supply convoys, rescue nuns being forcibly removed from their convents, and sabotage efforts to dissolve religious houses. She became known as the Ghost Abbess, appearing seemingly from nowhere to strike at enemies of the old faith. The economic warfare was equally sophisticated. Nuns had centuries of experience managing complex financial operations, and they used these skills against their enemies. They moved assets to friendly territories, created shell organizations to hide ownership of property, and manipulated markets to punish officials who supported convent dissolutions. The Abbess of Quedlinburg, one of the wealthiest women in the Holy Roman Empire, orchestrated a financial campaign that brought several German princes to the brink of bankruptcy. But perhaps the most devastating weapon in the nuns' arsenal was their moral authority. These women had spent their lives caring for the sick, educating children, and providing charity to the poor. When they claimed they were fighting for their right to continue this work, public opinion rallied to their cause. Soldiers found themselves questioning orders to attack women who had devoted their lives to serving God and community. The Battle of Gandersheim became the most famous military victory achieved by rebel nuns. When an army of 500 soldiers arrived to dissolve the abbey, they found the gates open and the nuns apparently submissive. What they didn't realize was that they were walking into a trap. The abbey's complex layout had been modified over months of preparation, creating killing zones and ambush points. When the soldiers entered, they found themselves separated and surrounded by women who fought with the desperation of cornered lions. Abbess Sophia of Gandersheim had studied every military manual in the abbey's extensive library. She understood that her nuns couldn't win through superior force, but they could win through superior strategy. She divided her defenders into small, mobile units that used their intimate knowledge of the abbey's layout to devastating effect. Soldiers found themselves lost in corridors that seemed to change, attacked from directions they couldn't predict, and facing enemies who disappeared into passages that only the nuns knew existed. The psychological impact of the Gandersheim victory rippled across Europe. If a group of cloistered nuns could defeat professional soldiers, what did that say about the strength of their cause? More importantly, what did it say about the weakness of those who opposed them? The victory inspired similar resistance in dozens of other convents, turning what had been isolated incidents into a coordinated rebellion. The rebel nuns also proved remarkably adept at guerrilla warfare. The Sisters of Mercy in southern France abandoned their convent when it became indefensible, but they didn't abandon their cause. Instead, they took to the countryside, operating as a mobile force that struck at officials and collaborators before disappearing into the vast network of safe houses maintained by sympathetic nobles and merchants. They rescued nuns from dissolved convents, recovered stolen church property, and eliminated informants who betrayed their operations. Their most audacious operation was the rescue of the Abbess of Cluny, who had been imprisoned for refusing to submit to new regulations. A team of 12 nuns, led by the formidable Sister Mathilde, infiltrated the castle where she was held, overpowered the guards, and spirited her away to safety. The rescue required months of planning, extensive intelligence gathering, and the kind of military precision that would have impressed professional soldiers. It also sent a clear message: no nun would be abandoned to her enemies. The transformation of these women from passive religious figures to active warriors challenged fundamental assumptions about gender, power, and authority. They proved that submission wasn't natural to women, but was rather a social construction that could be discarded when circumstances demanded it. They demonstrated organizational skills that rivaled those of any military commander, strategic thinking that outmaneuvered professional soldiers, and courage that inspired friends and terrified enemies. The correspondence between rebel abbesses reveals women who understood they were fighting not just for their individual convents, but for the future of female independence in European society. They saw their rebellion as part of a larger struggle between those who believed women could govern themselves and those who insisted on male domination in all aspects of life. Their letters speak of creating a new model of female religious life, one that combined traditional spiritual values with unprecedented political and military power. The end of the convent wars came not through military defeat, but through political compromise. The Catholic Church, faced with the reality that forced dissolution of convents was creating more problems than it solved, began negotiating with the rebel abbesses. The Treaty of Augsburg included provisions that protected existing convents while preventing the establishment of new ones, a compromise that neither side loved but both could accept. Sister Benedetta survived the siege of Santa Clara and lived to see her convent recognized as an independent religious house. She spent her remaining years writing a military manual for nuns, documenting the tactics and strategies that had proven effective during the rebellion. Her work, hidden in the convent archives for centuries, reveals a sophisticated understanding of warfare that challenges assumptions about medieval military knowledge. The legacy of the convent rebels extends far beyond their immediate victories. They proved that women could organize, fight, and win against seemingly overwhelming odds. They demonstrated that religious conviction could be combined with military action to create a formidable force for change. Most importantly, they showed that some things, freedom, dignity, the right to self-determination, were worth fighting for, even when the cost was everything they had previously held sacred. These women transformed from brides of Christ into warriors of faith, from submissive daughters into commanding generals, from symbols of purity into agents of revolutionary change. They fought not just with weapons, but with intelligence, strategy, and an unshakable belief that their cause was just. In the end, they won something more valuable than any individual battle. They won the right to exist on their own terms, answerable to God alone rather than to men who would remake them in their own image. The convent rebels remind us that resistance can take many forms, but the most effective resistance comes from those who have everything to lose and choose to fight anyway. These holy women went to war not because they loved violence, but because they loved their freedom more than they feared death. In doing so, they wrote one of the most remarkable chapters in the history of women's resistance to oppression. In the year 1151, while the greatest scholars of Europe debated whether women had souls and male physicians insisted that bloodletting could cure everything from headaches to broken bones, a Benedictine nun named Sister Hildegard was performing surgery that wouldn't be officially discovered by male doctors for another 400 years. Deep in the infirmary of her abbey at Rupertsberg, She was removing cataracts from patients' eyes using techniques so advanced that modern ophthalmologists study her methods with amazement. But here's the part that will shock you: she wasn't alone. Across medieval Europe, hidden behind convent walls, thousands of nuns were quietly revolutionizing medicine, astronomy, chemistry, and physics while the outside world dismissed them as mere prayer-sayers. This is the untold story of medieval science's greatest secret: how women who were supposedly devoted only to God became the most innovative researchers of their age. They developed life-saving medicines in monastery gardens, performed complex surgical procedures in infirmary chambers, and made astronomical discoveries that challenged everything the Church taught about the universe. They were the true pioneers of empirical science, conducting experiments and recording results centuries before the so-called scientific revolution. And the most devastating part? History gave their discoveries to men who stole credit for work they'd never done. The medieval world believed that knowledge belonged to men. Universities excluded women. Medical schools were forbidden to them. Scientific societies didn't exist, and if they had, women would have been banned from membership. But the men who made these rules overlooked one crucial fact: nuns were required to be literate. They had to read Latin, study scripture, and maintain libraries. More importantly, they had to care for the sick, manage vast agricultural operations, and solve practical problems that male scholars only theorized about. This created something unprecedented in human history: a network of highly educated women with unlimited time for research, extensive resources, and most crucially, the freedom to experiment without oversight. Sister Trota of Salerno represents the shocking reality of medieval women's medical knowledge. While male physicians were still consulting ancient Greek texts and refusing to touch patients directly, she was performing cesarean sections, developing pain management techniques for childbirth, and writing surgical manuals that male doctors would later plagiarize wholesale. Her work, The Diseases of Women, contained anatomical knowledge so accurate that it remained a definitive text on gynecology for 3 centuries. But when it was translated into Latin and distributed to universities, her name was removed and replaced with Trotula, a masculine version that allowed male scholars to claim credit for her discoveries. The systematic theft of women's scientific work became one of history's greatest cover-ups. The Abbess Herrat of Landsberg created an encyclopedia called Hortus Deliciarum that contained detailed illustrations of surgical instruments, astronomical charts, and mathematical calculations. When male scholars discovered it, they declared it divinely inspired, implying that no woman could have produced such sophisticated work through human intellect alone. The illustrations were copied, the calculations were used, and the credit went to unnamed, ancient masters, rather than the brilliant woman who had actually done the work. But perhaps the most shocking example of scientific theft involves the Benedictine nuns of the Abbey of Notre-Dame aux Nonnains in France. For over 2 centuries, these women operated what was essentially a medieval research hospital, developing surgical techniques, testing pharmaceutical compounds, and maintaining detailed medical records that tracked patient outcomes. Their success rate for complex procedures was so high that nobles traveled from across Europe to receive treatment from the holy healers. When the Renaissance brought renewed interest in medical knowledge, male physicians studied the nuns' techniques, copied their methods, and published them under their own names. The original innovators became footnotes in the history of medicine they had created. The pharmaceutical revolution began in convent gardens, not university laboratories. Medieval nuns were responsible for cultivating and cataloging thousands of medicinal plants, developing extraction techniques, and creating drug combinations that modern pharmacology is still trying to replicate. The gardens at the Abbey of St. Gall contained over 400 different medicinal plants, each carefully studied and documented for its therapeutic properties. Sister Euphemia, who managed these gardens in the 12th century, developed extraction processes that concentrated active compounds to levels that wouldn't be achieved by commercial pharmaceuticals until the 19th century. These women were conducting controlled experiments centuries before the scientific method was formally established. They tested different dosages, documented side effects, and tracked long-term outcomes with a precision that puts many modern studies to shame. The pharmacy records from the convent of Santa Maria Novella in Florence reveal systematic testing of hundreds of different compounds, with detailed notes on effectiveness, optimal dosing, and contraindications. When male physicians finally gained access to these records, they found treatments for diseases that academic medicine had considered incurable. The astronomical work conducted by medieval nuns challenges everything we think we know about the development of scientific knowledge. The abbess Herad we mentioned earlier wasn't just creating pretty pictures, she was conducting systematic observations of celestial movements and developing mathematical models to predict astronomical events. Her calculations were so accurate that they were used to reform the calendar, but the credit went to male astronomers who claimed they had rediscovered ancient knowledge. Sister Clementia of Barking Abbey represents one of the most remarkable scientific minds of the medieval period. Working in complete secrecy, she developed a heliocentric model of the solar system 300 years before Copernicus. Her manuscripts, hidden in the abbey's walls during the Reformation and only discovered during 20th century renovations, contain diagrams showing the Earth orbiting the Sun, along with mathematical proofs that demonstrate her understanding of gravitational forces. She understood that the Church would consider her ideas heretical, so she coded her discoveries in apparently religious texts, hiding revolutionary science inside mystical poetry. The precision of medieval nuns' astronomical observations was extraordinary. The convent of San Salvatore in Italy maintained detailed records of lunar cycles, planetary movements, and stellar positions that were more accurate than those produced by the most advanced observatories of the time. They developed improved astrolabes, created more precise sundials, and calculated the length of the year to within minutes of modern measurements. When Galileo pointed his telescope at the sky, he was confirming discoveries that nuns had made centuries earlier using only careful observation and mathematical calculation. Chemistry emerged from medieval convents through the practical needs of pharmaceutical production. The nuns at the Abbey of Fontevraud developed distillation techniques that were centuries ahead of their time, creating pure alcohol for medical purposes and extracting essential oils for therapeutic use. They understood chemical processes that academic alchemists were still mystifying with elaborate symbolism and pseudo-philosophical speculation. While male scholars debated the theoretical properties of mercury and sulfur, nuns were conducting practical experiments that laid the foundation for modern chemistry. Sister Zosima of the Convent of the Holy Sepulchre in Constantinople created what may be the first systematic classification of chemical compounds. Her work, written in coded Greek to avoid persecution, describes the properties of hundreds of different substances, their reactions with each other, and their practical applications. She developed techniques for purifying metals, creating stable compounds, and producing materials that were essential for advanced medical treatments. When Byzantine scholars finally gained access to her work, they hailed it as a miracle of divine inspiration rather than acknowledging it as the product of systematic scientific investigation. The anatomical knowledge possessed by medieval nuns was far superior to that taught in medical schools. Because they were responsible for caring for the sick and preparing bodies for burial, they had extensive hands-on experience with human anatomy. The nuns of the Hôtel Dieu in Paris performed dissections for educational purposes centuries before universities officially permitted the practice. They understood circulatory systems, nervous pathways, and organ functions that male physicians learned about only from ancient texts that were often inaccurate. Sister Marguerite La Chirurgienne earned her nickname through surgical skills that surpassed those of any male physician of her era. She developed techniques for treating compound fractures, removing kidney stones, and repairing damaged organs that saved thousands of lives. Her innovations in anesthesia, using combinations of opium, alcohol, and herbal compounds, made complex surgery possible at a time when most patients died from shock and pain. When male surgeons finally learned her techniques, they attributed them to classical authorities rather than acknowledging their true source. The preservation and advancement of classical knowledge was perhaps the nuns' greatest contribution to scientific progress. While barbarian invasions destroyed libraries and male scholars fled to safety, nuns remained in their convents, protecting precious manuscripts and continuing research. The Abbey of Gandersheim maintained one of the most complete collections of Greek scientific texts in medieval Europe. The nuns there didn't just preserve these works, they corrected errors, added commentary, and conducted experiments to verify ancient claims. The mathematician nun Hratsvitha of Gandersheim solved problems that had puzzled scholars for centuries. Her work on geometric proofs and algebraic equations was centuries ahead of its time, but because she was a woman, her discoveries were attributed to male contemporaries who had access to her manuscripts. When modern mathematicians finally studied her original works, they found solutions to problems that weren't officially solved until the Renaissance. The technological innovations developed in medieval convents were equally impressive. The nuns of St. Denis created improved looms that revolutionized textile production. The Abbey of St. Foy developed new techniques for working with metals that produced tools and weapons of unprecedented quality. The convent of Santa Caterina in Italy invented a printing system that predated Gutenberg's press by decades, using it to produce medical texts and astronomical charts for distribution to other convents. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of convent science was its collaborative nature. Unlike male scholars who jealously guarded their discoveries, nuns freely shared knowledge across their networks. The abbess Hildegard maintained correspondence with hundreds of other learned women, exchanging information about medical treatments, philosophical ideas, and scientific observations. This collaborative approach accelerated the pace of discovery and ensured that knowledge was preserved even when individual convents were destroyed. The suppression of convent science began during the Renaissance, when male scholars and church authorities realized that women's intellectual achievements threatened their monopoly on learning. Convents were forbidden to maintain certain types of libraries. Nuns were prohibited from corresponding about worldly subjects. Medical practice by women was increasingly restricted. The systematic campaign to erase women's contributions to science was so effective that by the Enlightenment, most people believed that women were naturally incapable of scientific thought. The recovery of this lost history has been one of the most exciting developments in modern scholarship. Archaeological excavations of dissolved convents have uncovered laboratories, libraries, and workshops that reveal the true extent of medieval women's scientific activities. Manuscript analysis has identified hundreds of works originally attributed to male authors that were actually written by nuns. Carbon dating of supposedly ancient scientific instruments has revealed that many were created in convents centuries before they were officially invented. The implications of these discoveries are staggering. The scientific revolution wasn't a sudden burst of male genius. It was the culmination of centuries of work by women whose contributions were systematically erased from history. The great advances of the Renaissance were built on foundations laid by medieval nuns who conducted experiments, made observations, and developed theories while the outside world dismissed them as incapable of rational thought. Modern scientists are finally giving credit where it's due. Medical schools now teach about Trotta of Salerno's contributions to surgery. Astronomy courses discuss the observations made by medieval nuns. Chemistry textbooks acknowledge the pharmaceutical innovations developed in convent laboratories. But the full story is still being uncovered, and each new discovery reveals just how much we owe to these forgotten pioneers of scientific knowledge. The medieval nuns who conducted science in secret weren't just challenging religious authority. They were challenging the fundamental assumptions about women's intellectual capabilities that had dominated human society for millennia. They proved that scientific genius isn't limited by gender, that innovation thrives when given freedom to explore, and that the pursuit of knowledge is too important to be monopolized by any single group. Their legacy lives on in every laboratory, every medical breakthrough, and every scientific discovery that improves human life. These women were the true founders of empirical science, conducting experiments and recording observations while male scholars debated theoretical abstractions. They were the pioneers of evidence-based medicine, developing treatments that actually worked while university-trained physicians killed patients with ignorant interventions. They were the architects of systematic knowledge, creating collaborative networks that shared discoveries across continents and centuries. History tried to erase them, but science remembers. Every time a researcher follows evidence rather than authority, every time a doctor treats a patient based on observation rather than dogma, every time a scientist challenges conventional wisdom with careful experimentation, they are following in the footsteps of medieval nuns who dared to seek truth behind convent walls. These women didn't just preserve knowledge, they advanced it, revolutionized it, and handed it to a world that refused to acknowledge their contributions. The debt we owe them can never be fully repaid, but it can finally be recognized. Picture this: it's Easter Sunday, 1380, and Catherine of Siena kneels before the altar, her body so emaciated that her ribs show through her habit like prison bars. She weighs less than 60 pounds, her hair has fallen out, and her teeth are loose in her gums. She hasn't eaten solid food in 8 years, nothing but communion wafers and water. The crowd watches in awe as she takes the host, believing they're witnessing a miracle. But what they're actually seeing is the slow, deliberate suicide of a brilliant woman who found the only form of control available to her in a world that offered none. Catherine will be declared a saint for her miraculous survival without food. The truth is far more disturbing than miraculous. Welcome to the dark side of medieval mysticism, where starvation became a pathway to power, where self-destruction was celebrated as divine intervention, and where some of the most intelligent women of their age slowly killed themselves while society cheered. This isn't a story about religious devotion, it's a story about women who discovered that in a world where they controlled nothing, they could at least control their own bodies. And in that terrible control, they found something that looked like freedom, but was actually the most sophisticated form of self-imprisonment ever devised. The phenomenon that modern psychologists call holy anorexia swept through medieval Europe like a plague, claiming the lives of hundreds of nuns and inspiring the worship of thousands more. These weren't isolated cases of individual women going too far in their spiritual practices. This was a systematic pattern of self-starvation that the Church not only tolerated but actively promoted as evidence of divine favor. The women who excelled at starving themselves became celebrities, attracting pilgrims, generating revenue for their convents, and wielding influence that queens envied. But here's what the hagiographies, the official saint stories, never tell you: these women weren't just fasting for God. They were using their bodies as weapons in a war for autonomy that they couldn't fight any other way. In medieval society, a woman's body belonged to her father, then her husband, then her sons. The only way to reclaim ownership was to destroy what others sought to control. Starvation became rebellion disguised as piety, a form of resistance so subtle that even the women themselves sometimes didn't recognize what they were doing. The psychology of holy anorexia was devastatingly complex. It began with genuine religious fervor, young women inspired by stories of saints who had transcended earthly needs through spiritual discipline. But it evolved into something far more dangerous, a competition for relevance in a world that offered women few paths to significance. If you couldn't be beautiful, you could be holy. If you couldn't be powerful, you could be miraculous. If you couldn't control your circumstances, you could control your appetite. And if you could survive on less food than anyone thought possible, you became living proof of divine intervention. Sister Marguerite of Hungary provides a perfect example of how this deadly game worked. Born into nobility, she entered a convent at age 10 after her parents decided they had too many daughters to marry off profitably. For 5 years, she lived a normal convent life, following the rules, saying her prayers, and remaining invisible among dozens of other nuns. Then she discovered fasting. Not the ordinary fasting required by her order, but extreme, prolonged starvation that pushed her body to its absolute limits. The transformation was immediate and intoxicating. Suddenly, this unremarkable young woman became the center of attention. Visitors came to see the miraculous maiden who lives on air. Church officials investigated her claims and declared them authentic. Donations poured into her convent from people who wanted to be associated with a living saint. For the first time in her life, Marguerite had power. She was consulted on important decisions, her prophetic visions were recorded and circulated, and her approval was sought by everyone from peasants to princes. But the price of this power was her life, paid in daily installments of deliberate starvation. Modern medical analysis of her recorded symptoms reveals a woman suffering from severe malnutrition, osteoporosis, and multiple organ failure. Her visions were likely hallucinations caused by starvation-induced brain damage. Her miraculous survival was actually a tortured dying process that took years to complete. She finally died at age 23, weighing approximately 50 pounds, and was immediately declared a martyr for the faith. The competitive aspect of holy anorexia created a grotesque spectacle where women tried to outstarve each other for spiritual status. Convents developed informal hierarchies based on who could survive on the least food. Novices were taught that eating was a sign of spiritual weakness, that true brides of Christ should be able to sustain themselves on divine love alone. The most successful practitioners became abbesses and spiritual directors, their emaciated bodies serving as living advertisements for the power of faith over flesh. The convent of St. Agnes in Prague became notorious for what contemporary chronicles called the Starvation Sisterhood. Under the leadership of Abbess Bonifacia, who claimed to have eaten nothing but communion wafers for 12 years, the convent developed a culture where extreme fasting was not just encouraged but required for advancement. Nuns who showed signs of hunger were subjected to public shame and assigned additional penances. Those who excelled at self-starvation were celebrated as examples for others to follow. The psychological mechanisms that drove these women to slowly kill themselves reveal sophisticated forms of self-control and self-destruction that modern psychology is still trying to understand. Food became the enemy to be conquered, the body became the battlefield, and survival became proof of spiritual superiority. The less they ate, the more holy they became. The more they suffered, the more they were revered. They discovered that in a world where women were valued primarily for their capacity to bear children and serve men, they could gain different kinds of value through the spectacular display of their own dissolution. But the most disturbing aspect of holy anorexia was how it was weaponized by the church itself. Church authorities recognized that these starving women attracted attention, generated donations, and provided convenient examples of spiritual dedication that could be used to inspire others. They created a system where women's self-destruction became a form of religious entertainment, where the slow suicide of brilliant individuals was celebrated as divine intervention. The case of Blessed Angela of Foligno illustrates how the Church transformed women's psychological trauma into religious propaganda. Angela began extreme fasting after experiencing what modern psychologists would recognize as a psychotic break triggered by the deaths of her husband and children. Her mystical experiences were actually dissociative episodes caused by starvation and grief. But the Church presented her visions as direct communications from God, her extreme behavior as proof of divine favor, and her eventual death from malnutrition as a miraculous translation to heaven. The medical reality behind these miracles was horrifying. Prolonged starvation causes systematic organ failure, beginning with the digestive system and progressing through the cardiovascular, nervous, and immune systems. The women who practiced holy anorexia experienced hair loss, tooth decay, osteoporosis, anemia, and eventually cardiac arrest. Their supernatural abilities to survive without food were actually the result of metabolic adaptations that the human body makes during starvation, adaptations that ultimately lead to death. The hallucinations and visions that these women experienced were documented side effects of prolonged malnutrition. Starvation causes chemical changes in the brain that produce vivid, often religious imagery. The sense of euphoria that many reported was the result of endorphins released during extreme physical stress. The feeling of transcendence was actually their brains shutting down non-essential functions to preserve life. What looked like divine intervention was actually the body's desperate attempt to survive systematic destruction. Yet these women found in their starvation something that looked like agency. In a world where their thoughts, words, and actions were controlled by others, they discovered that they could control their own consumption. They could choose to eat or not eat, to live or die, to suffer or not suffer. It was a terrible form of freedom, but it was the only freedom available to them. And in that freedom, they found a kind of power that transcended their earthly circumstances. The social dynamics surrounding holy anorexia reveal how medieval society processed female autonomy. These women were celebrated precisely because they were destroying themselves. Their self-starvation was acceptable because it rendered them harmless while providing entertainment and inspiration for others. They were allowed to have visions and prophetic insights because their physical condition made it clear that they posed no real threat to existing power structures. They could be holy as long as they were dying. The economic implications were equally disturbing. Convents with successful holy anorectics became pilgrimage destinations, generating substantial revenue from visitors who came to witness the miracles. The more extreme the starvation, the more visitors came, the more donations were received, and the more powerful the convent became. These women's slow suicides were literally monetized, their suffering transformed into economic advantage for the institutions that housed them. The competitive nature of holy anorexia created a culture of mutual destruction where women encouraged each other's self-starvation. Convents developed elaborate rituals around fasting, with public acknowledgments for those who ate the least and subtle shame for those who showed signs of normal appetite. The most successful practitioners became mentors, teaching newer nuns how to survive on minimal food while maintaining the appearance of health long enough to gain recognition for their achievements. The relationship between holy anorexia and mystical experience was complex and deeply troubling. Many of these women genuinely believed they were receiving divine communications, but modern analysis suggests that their visions were primarily the result of starvation-induced brain chemistry changes. The content of their visions often reflected their deepest fears and desires: union with Christ, escape from earthly suffering, and recognition of their spiritual worth. Their brains, starved of nutrition, created elaborate fantasies that provided the emotional satisfaction their real lives lacked. The writings left by some of these women provide heartbreaking insights into their psychological states. Sister Dorothea of Montaut wrote extensively about her fasting practices, describing the physical agony and emotional torment of her daily battle against hunger. But she also wrote about the sense of accomplishment, the feeling of spiritual elevation, and the attention she received from others. Her journals reveal a woman who understood that she was destroying herself but found in that destruction the only form of significance available to her. The Church's response to holy anorexia was systematically dishonest. Church officials knew that these women were starving themselves to death, but they promoted their behavior as miraculous because it served institutional interests. They created a narrative that transformed self-destruction into spiritual achievement, making it easier for other women to follow the same deadly path. They understood that extreme fasting attracted attention and donations, so they encouraged practices that they knew were lethal. The gender dynamics were particularly cruel. While male saints were celebrated for their intellectual achievements, artistic creations, and social reforms, female saints were most often recognized for their capacity to suffer and die in spectacular ways. Holy anorexia became one of the most reliable paths to female sainthood because it demonstrated the ultimate form of submission to the point of self-destruction. These women were canonized not for what they created, but for what they destroyed, themselves. The medical knowledge available to medieval physicians was sufficient to understand the dangers of prolonged fasting. Contemporary medical texts describe the symptoms of starvation and warn against extreme dietary restrictions. But this knowledge was ignored when it came to holy women, whose suffering was reframed as spiritual discipline rather than medical emergency. The same behaviors that would have been treated as illness in men were celebrated as virtue in women. The psychological profiles of women who engaged in holy anorexia reveal common patterns: high intelligence, strong will, deep sensitivity, and profound feelings of powerlessness. These were often the most capable women in their communities, individuals who might have excelled as scholars, leaders, or innovators if they had been born in different circumstances. Instead, they channeled their formidable abilities into the systematic destruction of their own bodies, finding in starvation the only arena where they could exercise their considerable talents. The social isolation that came with extreme fasting created additional psychological pressures. As these women became more emaciated, they became less able to participate in normal community activities. Their special status as wholly anorectic set them apart from their sisters, creating a lonely existence where their only companions were the visions produced by their starving brains. They became prisoners of their own achievements, trapped in cycles of self-destruction that they couldn't escape without losing the only identity that gave their lives meaning. The long-term effects on medieval religious culture were profound. Holy anorexia established a template for female sanctity that emphasized suffering over achievement, destruction over creation, and death over life. It created expectations that influenced how women understood their own spiritual possibilities and how society evaluated their religious worth. The legacy of holy anorexia can be traced through centuries of Christian mysticism, where women's self-destruction continued to be celebrated as evidence of divine favor. The recovery process for those who survived their experiments with holy anorexia was often impossible. The physical damage caused by prolonged starvation, bone loss, organ damage, metabolic disruption, was permanent. But the psychological damage was often worse. Women who had built their entire identity around not eating found themselves unable to develop normal relationships with food, their bodies, or their own sense of self-worth. They had learned to equate starvation with holiness, making it impossible to pursue health without feeling like they were betraying their spiritual commitments. The parallels between medieval holy anorexia and modern eating disorders are striking and disturbing. Both involve the use of food restriction as a method of control in situations where other forms of agency are unavailable. Both create cycles of achievement and self-destruction that become increasingly difficult to break. Both are often misunderstood by observers who focus on the visible behaviors rather than the underlying psychological dynamics. The main difference is that medieval society celebrated what we now recognize as pathological. Understanding holy anorexia requires us to see these women as complex individuals rather than simple victims or saints. They were making calculated decisions about how to navigate impossible circumstances. They found in self-starvation a form of agency that, while ultimately destructive, provided them with experiences of power, recognition, and spiritual significance that they couldn't obtain any other way. Their choices were rational responses to irrational circumstances. The theological implications of holy anorexia challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between body and spirit, suffering and holiness, sacrifice and love. These women pushed the logic of Christian asceticism to its ultimate conclusion, revealing the inherent contradictions in a religious system that celebrated the destruction of God's creation in the name of serving God. Their extreme practices forced the Church to confront the difference between meaningful sacrifice and meaningless self-destruction. The end of the holy anorexia phenomenon came gradually as the Church developed more sophisticated theological understanding and as medical knowledge advanced. The Counter-Reformation brought new emphasis on practical service rather than mystical experience, redirecting female religious energy toward education, healthcare, and social reform. But the damage had been done. Hundreds of brilliant women had destroyed themselves in pursuit of a form of holiness that was ultimately hollow. The story of holy anorexia serves as a warning about the dangers of celebrating suffering for its own sake, of confusing self-destruction with self-transcendence, and of creating social systems where the most vulnerable members can only gain recognition through spectacular acts of self-harm. These women deserved better from their society, their church, and their God. They deserved to be valued for their minds rather than their ability to destroy their bodies, for their potential rather than their capacity for suffering, for their lives rather than their deaths. In the end, holy anorexia represents one of history's most tragic ironies. women who sought to transcend their earthly limitations through the systematic destruction of their earthly existence, only to discover that the recognition they achieved came at the cost of everything that made life worth living. They gained the whole world's attention and lost their own souls, not to God, but to a culture that found their suffering more valuable than their survival. What if the most powerful banking network in medieval Europe wasn't run by the Medici or the Templars, but by women who had supposedly renounced all worldly possessions? Behind the stone walls and iron gates of medieval convents lay one of history's most sophisticated and overlooked economic empires. While monks received credit for preserving knowledge and knights for their military prowess, nuns quietly built financial networks that spanned continents, manipulated international markets, and accumulated wealth that rivaled kingdoms. This wasn't merely religious devotion, it was economic warfare disguised as divine service. The transformation began in the 11th century when European convents discovered that their reputation for honesty and permanence made them ideal financial institutions. Unlike merchant families who could flee or die, convents were eternal entities backed by divine authority. This made them perfect repositories for wealth and, more importantly, perfect lenders. The convent of Saint Foy in France pioneered what became known as sacred banking. Under the guise of managing pilgrimage donations, the nuns developed sophisticated accounting systems that tracked loans, interest rates, and investment returns across multiple currencies. They called it stewardship of God's bounty. But their ledgers reveal a different story: compound interest calculations, risk assessments, and profit margins that would make modern hedge fund managers envious. The genius lay in the presentation. When secular moneylenders faced accusations of usury, a mortal sin, convents presented their lending as charitable assistance with voluntary gratitude offerings. The church couldn't condemn its own institutions, creating a legal loophole that nuns exploited ruthlessly. By 1200, the Benedictine nuns of Nivelles controlled more liquid capital than the combined treasuries of France and England. Medieval convents didn't just lend money, they controlled production of Europe's most valuable commodities. The secret lay in their monopoly over skilled female labor, and their access to rare materials through religious networks. The Cistercian nuns of Helfta perfected illuminated manuscript production, but their real innovation was creating artificial scarcity. By deliberately limiting output and maintaining strict quality standards, they drove up prices astronomically. A single illuminated psalter from Helfta cost more than a knight's annual income, yet demand consistently exceeded supply. The nuns had discovered luxury marketing 5 centuries before anyone coined the term. Textile production proved even more lucrative. The poor Clares of Assisi, ironically named for their vow of poverty, controlled the European market for gold thread embroidery. They maintained this monopoly through industrial espionage disguised as religious exchange visits. When nuns from other orders arrived to share in spiritual fellowship, they were actually conducting corporate reconnaissance, stealing techniques, and identifying market opportunities. The most audacious scheme involved silk production. The Dominican nuns of Poissy convinced the French court that their silk was blessed by direct divine intervention, allowing them to charge premium prices for what they claimed were miracle textiles. In reality, they had smuggled silkworms from Constantinople and established Europe's first major silk production facility within their convent walls. The profits were staggering. Silk sales alone funded the construction of cathedrals across northern France. While merchants struggled with banditry, wars, and untrustworthy partners, convents created the medieval world's most reliable trade network. The nun route connected religious houses from Novgorod to Naples, from Dublin to Damascus, creating a communication and commerce system that operated regardless of political upheavals. The system worked through a brilliant exploitation of religious neutrality. Convents claimed to be above earthly conflicts, allowing their messengers and goods to pass through war zones unmolested. In reality, these pilgrims and religious supplies formed a sophisticated courier and transport network that made modern logistics companies look primitive. The Abbey of Fontevraud served as the European headquarters for this operation. Abbess Petronilla de Chemmel established standardized weights, measures, and currency exchange rates that were recognized from Scotland to Sicily. Her spiritual correspondence with other abbesses actually contained encoded market intelligence, price fluctuations, and trade opportunities. When historians finally decoded these letters in the 19th century, they revealed detailed commodity reports, weather forecasts affecting harvests, and political intelligence that would have been invaluable to any merchant empire. The network's most profitable venture was the spice trade. While Venice dominated Mediterranean routes, convents controlled the overland passages through their connections with Orthodox monasteries in the east. The nuns of St. Clare in Ghent established a direct pipeline to Byzantine spice merchants, bypassing traditional intermediaries and capturing enormous profit margins. Their account books show returns of 400 to 600% on spice investments, returns that funded massive expansion of their temporal holdings. The most shocking discovery in recent historical research concerns the secret partnerships between convents and Europe's great banking families. Rather than competing, these seemingly opposite institutions formed clandestine alliances that dominated European finance for centuries. The Medici Bank's rise wasn't just due to innovation and political connections, it was built on a foundation of convent partnerships that provided capital, credibility, and cover. Cosimo de' Medici's personal correspondence, hidden in the Laurentian library for centuries, reveals regular payments to the monastery of San Marco that far exceeded any legitimate donation. In exchange, the nuns provided services that would be illegal for secular institutions: money laundering, tax avoidance, and political bribery disguised as religious offerings. The arrangement worked perfectly. When the Medici needed to move large sums without attracting attention, they donated money to San Marco for cathedral construction. The nuns then purchased supplies from Medici front companies, effectively returning the money while creating paper trails that showed only pious donations and religious expenditures. Tax collectors and political enemies saw only charitable giving, while the real business continued in secret. This model spread across Europe. The Fugger banking empire employed identical tactics with Bavarian convents, while English monasteries served as financial fronts for Italian merchants seeking to evade usury laws. The Hanseatic League's expansion was funded partially through partnerships with Baltic convents who provided both capital and local knowledge for trade ventures. Medieval religious festivals weren't just spiritual celebrations. They were massive money-laundering operations that allowed convents to convert illicit profits into legitimate wealth. The system was so sophisticated that it took modern forensic accounting techniques to understand its true scope. The annual feast of St. Bridget at Kildare Abbey generated more revenue than the combined output of Ireland's major cities, yet the source of this wealth remained mysteriously vague in official records. Recent analysis of surviving documents reveals the truth. The festival was a carefully orchestrated financial exchange that allowed criminal enterprises, corrupt nobles, and foreign agents to clean their money through seemingly innocent religious donations. The mechanism was ingenious. Criminals would arrive as pilgrims, bearing valuable offerings for the saint. These offerings, gold, silver, precious gems, and foreign currency, were recorded as anonymous donations motivated by religious devotion. The nuns would then bless the donors with return gifts of locally produced goods, legitimate currency, or land deeds that couldn't be traced to criminal sources. The scale was enormous. Conservative estimates suggest that major religious festivals processed the equivalent of millions of modern dollars in illicit funds annually. The Feast of St. James at Santiago de Compostela alone handled enough suspicious transactions to destabilize entire regional economies if the truth had been revealed. While kings fought expensive wars to expand their territories, convents employed more subtle methods to accumulate vast land holdings that eventually exceeded royal domains. Their strategy combined legal manipulation, emotional exploitation, and economic pressure to create property empires that lasted for centuries. The primary tactic was spiritual inheritance. Wealthy individuals facing death were convinced to leave substantial property to convents in exchange for guaranteed prayers for their souls and their families. The nuns became expert psychologists, identifying the fears and guilt of potential donors and crafting persuasive arguments for massive bequests. The Benedictine nuns of Chelles perfected this approach. Their records showed detailed psychological profiles of wealthy targets, including family relationships, business concerns, and spiritual anxieties. They then crafted individualized approaches that made enormous donations seem like spiritual necessities rather than financial losses. But convents didn't just wait for donations. They actively acquired property through strategic purchases, foreclosures, and marriage arrangements. The Abbey of Quedlinburg controlled territory equivalent to a small kingdom by arranging marriages between abbey-sponsored nobles and property owners, then ensuring that inheritance laws favored the convent's interests. The most audacious land grab occurred in England, where the Abbey of Shaftesbury accumulated holdings worth more than most royal estates. They achieved this through a century-long campaign of strategic marriages, debt manipulation, and legal challenges that gradually transferred ownership of vast territories into their control. By 1400, Shaftesbury's lands generated annual revenues that exceeded the income of most European monarchs. The peaceful image of medieval religious life concealed brutal economic competition between different monastic orders. These weren't theological disputes. They were corporate wars fought with financial weapons, industrial espionage, and market manipulation tactics that would be familiar to any modern business strategist. The conflict between Cistercian and Benedictine nuns over wool production in northern England resembled a modern trade war. The Cistercians had developed superior sheep breeding techniques that produced higher quality wool, threatening Benedictine market dominance. The Benedictines responded with what can only be described as economic sabotage. They spread rumors about Cistercian wool being cursed, bribed merchants to refuse Cistercian products, and even sponsored raids on Cistercian flocks disguised as routine bandit attacks. The Cistercians retaliated by establishing alternative trade routes that bypassed Benedictine-controlled markets, creating their own merchant partnerships, and launching a propaganda campaign that portrayed Benedictine wealth as spiritual corruption. The conflict escalated until papal intervention was required, not for theological reasons, but because the economic warfare was destabilizing entire regional markets. Similar conflicts erupted across Europe. Franciscan and Dominican orders fought viciously over urban property rights in Italian cities, using legal challenges, political influence, and economic pressure to seize each other's assets. The poor clercs and urbanist clercs engaged in a decades-long battle for control of textile markets that involved industrial espionage, supply chain disruption, and financial warfare that would have impressed Renaissance banking families. When Henry VIII dissolved English monasteries in the 1530s, official justifications focused on religious reform and royal authority. The truth was far more prosaic. The crown desperately needed money, and monastic wealth had grown too large to ignore. But even Henry's commissioners were shocked by what they discovered. Initial estimates suggested that English monasteries controlled perhaps 10 to 15% of national wealth. The actual figure was closer to 40%. Centuries of careful accumulation, strategic investment, and hidden partnerships had created economic empires that dwarfed royal resources. The dissolution wasn't religious reform. It was the largest corporate takeover in English history. The inventory records revealed the scope of monastic wealth. The Abbey of Glastonbury alone possessed cash reserves equivalent to $50 million in modern currency, plus land holdings, commercial investments, and international financial partnerships that generated annual revenues exceeding those of major European cities. Smaller houses often possessed wealth that exceeded that of great noble families. But the most shocking discoveries concerned the international connections. English convents maintained active business partnerships with French, German, and Italian institutions that continued operating despite political conflicts between their respective nations. These networks had created a parallel economy that operated independently of royal authority. a medieval multinational corporation disguised as religious devotion. The systematic erasure of convent economic power from historical records wasn't accidental. It was a deliberate campaign by secular authorities who recognized the threat posed by independent female economic networks. Church hierarchies, threatened by evidence of female financial competence, collaborated in this historical revision. The official narrative portrayed nuns as passive recipients of charity rather than active economic agents. Documents highlighting their business acumen were systematically destroyed, archived in inaccessible locations, or deliberately misinterpreted by male historians who couldn't conceive of medieval women as sophisticated financial operators. This revisionism was so successful that even modern historians initially dismissed evidence of convent economic power as exaggeration or mistake. Only in recent decades have feminist historians and economic specialists begun reconstructing the true scope of medieval nuns' financial influence, revealing one of history's greatest cover-ups. The techniques pioneered by medieval convents, fractional reserve banking, international credit systems, risk assessment, and portfolio diversification, formed the foundation of modern financial systems. The Medici, Fuggers, and other celebrated banking families weren't innovators. They were students of nuns who had developed these methods centuries earlier. More importantly, the convent networks demonstrated that alternative economic models could challenge traditional power structures. By creating systems based on cooperation rather than competition, sustainability rather than extraction, and community benefit rather than individual profit, medieval nuns proved that different approaches to wealth and power were possible. Their success was so threatening to established orders that it had to be erased from history. But the evidence remains, hidden in archives and account books, waiting to remind us that the medieval world's most successful economists wore habits, not doublets, and that sometimes the most revolutionary ideas come from the most unexpected sources. The Great Convent Conspiracy wasn't a conspiracy at all. It was simply brilliant women using the only tools available to them to build economic power in a world that officially denied them such opportunities. Their success was so complete that it took centuries of deliberate historical revision to hide their achievements. Today, as we grapple with questions about economic inequality, sustainable development, and alternative financial systems, perhaps it's time to study the medieval nuns who quietly revolutionized European economics while the men were busy fighting wars and building monuments to their own glory. The real financial revolution began not in Renaissance Italy, but in the counting houses of medieval convents, where women who had supposedly renounced the world instead learned to master it.